Okay, so to end up the presentation, I'm going to give just a very brief sampling of some authors that I really appreciate for different reasons. The first of those that you'll see on this first slide is F. Scott Fitzgerald, and specifically The Great Gatsby. The first memory that I have of really noticing Fitzgerald as an author was when I was in high school. Certainly we read The Great Gatsby, and although I have fuzzy memories of liking it. It was nowhere near the torrid love that I have for it now. After having taught it and read it for 11 years in a row, I really, it's my favorite book that I teach all year. The thing that I love about Fitzgerald is that he chooses beautiful words and strings them together in such a way that is just captivating to me. So both actual word choice and sentence structure are something that I really appreciate about him as a writer, and that those are things that I try and pay attention to in my own writing. So I'm going to read a short little excerpt from The Great Gatsby that demonstrates some of that word fluency that I really appreciate about him. There's many places where I could quote from, but the place that I'm going to read to you here is right in the beginning of the book, where the narrator named Nick Carraway is introducing himself to the reader and is also talking in a flashback type of a way about his sort of character judgment of the character Gatsby, who has not yet been seen in the book. And so Nick says, when I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness, such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. In my opinion, writers don't write like this anymore. Love Fitzgerald. The next author that I mentioned on the slides is Jhumpa Lahiri. She's a rather young author. The only thing I've read by her is short stories. I first discovered her actually in a graduate literature course several years ago, at which time she was just starting to come onto the scene and was very well received. So this is a collection of her short stories at the time called Interpreter of Maladies. And the thing that there's a few things that I really like about her writing. First of all, she is East Indian, and she writes about characters and stories in that context of that culture group, which is not something that I have, direct personal or extensive personal experience with. However, despite that, she really pulls me into the story. So as a writer, something that I appreciate about her is that she is able to reach out to someone who is not automatically biased toward her characters or her subject matter, and pull them into the story in a really engaging way. Another thing that I appreciate about her is that she can write good short stories, which is something that I can't do or haven't been able to do up until this point. In the past, I've attempted to write both novels and short stories, and don't consider myself successful at it. Those two genres just are not my forte. I find it difficult to create believable, realistic characters who have believable, realistic conversations with a plot line that is interesting and compelling enough to really pull you along in the story. So I have an appreciation for people who can do it well, because I don't consider myself to have that skill. All right, so the next person that I've mentioned on the slides is Billy Collins. These are two of his collections of poetry. He was a poet laureate at one point in the not too distant past. I did have a third book of his, which was actually autographed by him in person. I was able to meet him and to sit in on a Q&A at the Dodge Poetry Festival in New Jersey a couple of years ago, and that was fantastic. That copy, I think, has been lost to a student, but that's okay. So I could read both of these books to you as examples of what I love about Billy Collins, but I've chosen just two poems out of the one. He writes in free verse. He writes with a lot of simple and plain and straightforward language, which really makes it accessible, but he also does throw in, you know, $2 words every once in a while. What I really love most, I think, about Billy Collins is his flexibility. And so he can go his range of tone and mood. So he can start with something very witty and lighthearted and just really funny. And he can somehow weave it within the short space of a poem to the point where it is deep and introspective and philosophical and profound. And he does it in such a way that sometimes you see it coming, but sometimes you don't, and you just find yourself there at the end with your jaw on the floor. And so he's just brilliant. So two poems. The first one is called Bathtub Families. Bathtub Families is not just a phrase I made up, though it would have given me pleasure to have written those words in a notebook, then looked up at the sky, wondering what they meant. No, I saw bathtub families in a pharmacy on the label of a clear plastic package containing 1 cow and 4 calves, a little family of animals meant to float in your tub. I hesitated to buy it because I knew I would then want the entire series of bathtub families, which would leave no room in the tub for the turtles, the pigs, the seals, the giraffes, and me. It's enough just to have the words, which alone makes me even more grateful that I was born in America and English is my mother tongue. I was lucky, too, that I waited for the pharmacist to fill my prescription. Otherwise, I might not have wandered down the aisle with the bathtub families. I think what I am really saying is that language is better than reality, so it doesn't have to be bath time for you to enjoy all the bathtub families as they float in the air around your head. Another thing that I really like about Billy Collins is that he's very metacognitive, and so in many of his poems he is aware that he is a poet and a writer, and he writes that into the poem. He acknowledges the reality of writing that poem. He acknowledges the reality of me reading that poem and what our inherent relationship is through the page. I find that really fascinating and really interesting. And so this poem shows a little bit more of an example of that. This is called The Great American Poem. If this were a novel, it would begin with a character, a man alone on a southbound train, or a young girl on a swing by a farmhouse. And as the pages turned, you would be told that it was morning or the dead of night, and I, the narrator, would describe for you the miscellaneous clouds over the farmhouse, and what the man was wearing on the train, right down to his red tartan scarf, and the hat he tossed onto the rack above his head, as well as the cows sliding past his window. Eventually, one can only read so fast, you would either learn that the train was bearing the man back to the place of his birth, or that he was headed into the vast unknown, and you might just tolerate all of this as you waited patiently for shots to ring out in a ravine where the man was hiding, or for a tall, raven-haired woman to appear in a doorway. But this is a poem, not a novel, and the only characters here are you and I, alone in an imaginary room which will disappear after a few more lines, leaving us no time to point guns at one another or toss all our clothes into a roaring fireplace. I ask you, who needs the man on the train, and who cares what his black valise contains? We have something better than all this turbulence lurching toward some ruinous conclusion. I mean, the sound that we will hear as soon as I stop writing and put down this pen. I once heard someone compare it to the sound of crickets in a field of wheat, or, more faintly, just the wind over that field, stirring things that we will never see. Billy Collins is brilliant, in my opinion. The next writer that I've mentioned on here is E. Cummings, and I don't have, I wouldn't say I have extensive reader knowledge of him, but I remember that reading or discovering his poetry in high school was really a turning point for me as far as being allowed to break the rules in the way that he did. I had never seen anybody do that with spacing and capitalization and all the different forms that he takes his poetic license in, and so that really freed me as a writer to be able to play with those things on my own, which is, especially in poetry, something that I strongly incorporate. That really influences me about E.E. Cummings. And the last writer that I want to talk about is Emily Dickinson. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the presentation that I don't like as a writer is rhyming in poetry, or extensive rhyming in a very fixed pattern. It ends up sounding a little sing-songy to me, which I don't really care for. A lot of her poems have rhymes, which I don't like, but some of them don't. And what I find compelling about Emily Dickinson is I know a little bit about her life story, her solitude, her death, which was very sad. And so in my mind, she's sort of this sad, beautiful figure, and I think that that is reflected in her poetry. And so a poem that speaks of that to me is this one that I'll read to you from her collection. I should not dare to leave my friend, because if he should die while I was gone, and I